Sounds good.
Today, my guest is Professor Peter Liesch. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Peter as a person, Professor Liesch as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Liesch is an AIB Fellow and a member of the Economic Society of Australia. He is also a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Management. His research is published in diverse journals in IB, Operations Management, HR Management, Marketing and Technology Management. He sits on the editorial boards of JIBS and the Journal of International Management. He is currently an area editor of JIBS, and he has been a senior editor of the Journal of World Business. He has co-edited special issues with JIBS, Journal of World Business, and Australian Journal of Management. He has written over 60 articles, 10 chapters, and 3 textbooks. In 2019, he was awarded the 50th Anniversary Silver Medal for publications in JIBS. He was an early adopter of the AIB 39 Country Initiative with a container of textbooks delivered to Kenya. Thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you, Ilgaz. It's my privilege to be part of this program, and I look forward to your asking me questions about how I see IB and why I ended up in IB.
Thank you. First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
So that's an interesting question to start off with, because I'm a child of the early 50s, 1950s, and context, I guess, is important. And when I grew up, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more later, we didn't have television, and I used to listen to the radio, a valve radio, an old radio, as a young boy. And at the time, the Soviet Union was prominent in space, and I was intrigued by what was going on there. So, look, you're asking me that question. I'd like to say I had ambitions of being a cosmonaut, but that's not true. That's not true. I didn't. And going on at the same time, my dad had various occupations. In fact, when I think about this, I actually attended 6 primary schools in 7 years as a young boy and 2 secondary schools. So I'd been through 8 schools in my primary and secondary education. So we moved house quite a lot. And my dad was variously a farmer, a builder, and a hotel publican. And I remember going with him to construction sites when he was building and helping him as a young boy. So I guess if I really thought about it, I probably had ambitions of following suit. I enjoyed being on the farm. I can remember being put on a tractor as a young boy when I couldn't even touch the pedals with my feet. And I'd spend the day driving round and round, ploughing a field. So in Australia, agriculture is very large. And I'd be put on the tractor and early in the morning, and my father would jump on the tractor at morning tea to stop it, and we'd have a cup of tea beside the wheel. And the same would happen at lunch, and the same would happen at afternoon tea. And I loved this. I felt quite a hero just driving this big machine. And so I guess in those days, I would have anticipated either being a builder or a farmer. But no, I really didn't think about it a lot. But that was my life as a young boy. It was a great life.
Yeah, it sounds great. Where did you grow up?
I beg your pardon?
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up on what's called the Darling Downs in Australia. So Brisbane is the capital. I live in the state of Queensland, which is in the northern part of Australia. If you travel west of Brisbane, you come to a town called Toowoomba, and Toowoomba is the commercial hub for the Darling Downs, which is a very rich and expansive grain growing, cereal growing agricultural area. So as I said, we moved around a lot between hotels and a farm and building, but we were always on the Darling Downs, other than for a very short period in the 1950s when my dad was building houses on the Gold Coast, which is close to where I am now in Brisbane, but mainly on the Darling Downs in Queensland.
And when did you realize the difference between domestic versus international?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, an appropriate one, obviously, for IB scholars. So as I said, yeah, I used to be fascinated listening to the radio in the evenings. And I would listen to, I think in those days, I'm not sure, but I think it would have been BBC World Service. And I used to listen to this news reports about the Russians in space. And I used to also be fascinated, because of my agricultural background, in the dire situation of agricultural crops failing in big countries like the Soviet Union or Russia and China. And you know, coming from an agricultural background, this was unfathomable to me that agriculture would fail and it would threaten the lives of people. But it was true, and I would listen to the radio with intent that hundreds of thousands of people were dying in some parts of the world because crops were failing. So thinking about it now, that was probably my first introduction to the fact that there was a big world out there beyond where I lived. And it was a world where lots of things were happening, scientific developments like the space programs, and basic things like agriculture failing. So, yeah, I lived in a very localized world, which was a very healthy and vibrant and expansive world. But there was a big world beyond me. And that stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, probably more often than we imagine, living in Australia, we look at the world differently than people look at the world from other parts. I guess we all look at the world in particular ways, but living in the Southern Hemisphere where we do here, we look north and most of the world is there, and it's different. It's different in lots of ways compared to Australia. And that's been highlighted right at the moment with this pandemic problem. So, yeah, I became acutely aware of my local environment, my domestic context, and the international context at a very, very young age.
Very interesting, fascinating. What is something that people might find interesting that you wouldn't put on your CV?
Yes, that's interesting too, because we don't put everything on our CVs. There are a few things that aren't on my CV that people might find interesting. One of those would be, from a scholarly point of view, I've never actually studied any one course in international business in my whole life. I've never studied a course in international business. And now, and for the last quite a reasonable period of time, it's been my life, but I've never actually studied a course in international business. And in another context, I guess I've had a different life since I wrote when I wrote up until I wrote my PhD, I'd still been, this is my 45th year in academia. So I've been in academia a long time. But for the first half of that, I had other lives alongside my academic life. For example, after I finished my master's degree, I actually bought a farm, and it was a reasonable farm, and it was probably the size of an enterprise that one could have made a living out of by itself. But I was teaching. In fact, in those days, I was teaching statistics and industry economics. But I bought a farm because my master's was in agricultural economics. And I took a decision that and I liked agricultural economics, that if I bought a farm, I might be able to demonstrate that I knew a bit about ag economics. So I did buy a farm. It was a horticultural enterprise. It took a while to build it up. My father was very interested in it with his agricultural background, so we worked together on it. So basically, the farm was, I grew tomatoes. I grew tomatoes for 8 months of the year. Tomatoes, zucchini, melons, pumpkins. I had cattle, and I also had a few hectares of lychee and avocado trees, a small orchard. So I enjoyed that life. It was productive and healthy, and I made money out of it alongside my academic career. I sold that farm because also at the same time, and this is not on my CV, I received in the early 1980s, after my interest in my master's, I received a secondment to go to Western Samoa in the middle of the Pacific. And I was to spend a year there, which I did. And part of my remit was to help set up a school of agriculture attached to the University of the South Pacific and work with the Australian government on some of the aid projects that the Australian government was involved in Western Samoa. So this was a phenomenally interesting interlude into my life. I was still in my late 20s, so it was different. And I came back to Australia and resurrected my interest in the farm. And lo and behold, 18 months later, I was back in Fiji for another year doing much the same. So I enjoyed that life. And in fact, it was in Fiji that I decided that I should write a PhD, because I was working alongside agricultural specialists from Belgium and New Zealand in dairying and horticulture and so on. And their meal ticket was a PhD. And I thought, gee, I like this life. It was interesting and different, but I needed to write a PhD. So that prompted me to actually write a PhD. So, you know, things changed after that. I sold the farm because it was too intense and I couldn't allocate time to it. And I went through a lot of decision processes myself at that stage as to whether I wanted to buy a bigger farm and become more substantially an agriculturalist, or whether I would take the other path into academia and substantiate a career in academia. So I actually took the latter part, sold the farm, invested it in real estate up on what we call the Sunshine Coast here in Queensland. And interesting, there with my dad, we built home units, housing apartments. So I had another dimension to my life for a while, building with my dad, even though I still had an academic full-time job at the same time. But in those days, we could do that. We could mix an academic career with other interests. But you can't do that anymore. The demands of an academic career are just too great. So that's not on my CV, but it's been a big part of my life in the past. And I guess to a large degree, it's still a big part of me. I still enjoy knowing about agriculture and that aspect of the Australian economy, but I don't participate in it.
Fascinating. Looking back at the things you've done, are there things that you say, is there a thing that you wish you would have done that you didn't? Do you have a regret?
Look, yes, I do. I have regrets. If people say they don't have regrets, I just don't believe them. I think we all have regrets. Like, thinking about it, since you approached me about this interview, one regret I do have is when I finished my master's, I was at the University of New England, Australia, which was well reputed for its ag economics. And my colleagues there, my student colleagues, ended up in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, for example, working in agricultural and economic development. And I could have been in that cohort, but I chose not to. And I sometimes wonder if I'd pursued that career, what life would be like. And I also similarly wonder what life would have been like if I'd pursued the first career when I left school. When I graduated from secondary school, I actually won a scholarship with a big company in Australia called Colonial Sugar Refining Company Limited, which was to study chemical engineering. Because I'd been a pure academic student at school in the maths and sciences, I won this scholarship. It was prestigious. There are only a few handed out in Australia. So when I left school, I went to Sydney to study, and part of the deal was to work part-time with CSR in their sugar refineries or their distilleries, and then you would complete the latter part of your course full-time. So I actually started off studying chemical engineering. After the first year, that changed to geology, geophysics, because CSR at that stage were getting heavily involved in the mining industry in Australia, which was just starting to take off in a big way. Keep in mind, this is the late 60s, very early 70s. So CSR wanted me to change to geology, geophysics, which I did. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I got disheartened with that, with CSR generally, and I left and chose to study actually a business degree, where I first met economics, and it was from then on that I started to develop a serious interest in things economics. So that's not on my CV. But I do wonder what life would have been like as an executive, possibly today in CSR. I do wonder what life would have been like as an ag economist in the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or some other development agency in the world. But I'm in this life, and I'm very happy, and it's been a most rewarding life. So. But it's been a different path right into academia than a lot of people might have chosen.
True. How the choices we make. About research, how do you describe your research to people who don't read scholarly articles, and how do you explain the importance of your work?
So, look, I wrote my PhD on a topic called government-mandated countertrade. It was written in economics, and government-mandated countertrade is when governments form arrangements with large companies to wrestle special concessions out of those companies to have some of that workload done in their own economies. So this is when governments buying computer equipment, or at the time, Australia, Qantas was a government-owned airline in Australia, and when Qantas would buy commercial aircraft, the Australian government would wrestle special concessions out of Boeing and so on to have technologies placed in the Australian industrial sectors and so on. So that got me involved in what's going on in the world of multinationality with big companies. And it's not only big companies, because that workload that's being delivered in Australia at the time was actually workload taken up by small and medium-sized tech firms building components for jets and military equipment and so on. So that got me in the world of big firms and little firms and the relationships between big firms and little firms. So from the early days, my interest has been how small firms engage with big firms in the world of international business, and how those small firms move into the international arena through one means or another. So this is all about the internationalization process of firms and how firms go about engaging overseas. So that's basically what my main interest is. I have a particular interest in notions of exchange in those relationships, but it's not something that I've been able to grapple with substantially through theorising those types of concepts. But necessarily, when I talk about big firms and little firms engaging, I'm necessarily talking about markets and how markets operate to provide the foundation for which firms engage with one another. I'd love to write a theory of markets, but I'm not smart enough to do that. But that's always underlying, my interests, markets and engagement with markets and how markets are created. So, yeah, that's my interest generally.
About understudied areas in IB research, underutilized contexts, some new variables that people should be looking at. So I want to ask you a question about what do you see as the next 5 to 10 years in the field as the most lucrative areas?
Yes, that's interesting. Look, as time goes on, I don't in writing papers or thinking about the journal to do this, but privately I probably do. I retreat back to some of my economics days and how economists think about the world, and economists grapple with similar things to what we do. In fact, from time to time, I've been asked how I perceive IB, and I very early in my career I struck upon this notion rapidly that I describe international business as the microeconomics of international economics, and one thing that economists are very good at, I mean, in the recent past, they're not very good at lots of things like explaining phenomena and predicting and so on, but they're very good at understanding the assumptions that they need to make in their theorising and their empirical work. And one thing I don't think IB people particularly do well is outlining the assumptions implicit in their work. There are explicit assumptions and there are implicit assumptions, and I think we could do better in IB if we thought more about those assumptions, because it's those assumptions that we make and that we should make, but we don't make, that tend to prove or disprove what we're trying to say about IB phenomena. So I think we should spend more time in our theorising and our empirical work about what assumptions we are making about the people that are doing international business, particularly, and the behavioural assumptions and so on. I think if you ask me for a particular variable, there's probably lots of variables, but one variable or one dimension that I've wedded to in the last several years, and this was a consequence of conversations with a dear colleague who's no longer with us, Professor Lawrence Welch, who has meant a lot to me in my career, but he's no longer with us. We used to talk a lot about uncertainty and risk. And the more I understand about IB and what's going on in the IB domain, the more I come to the conclusion that we should spend more time theorising about uncertainty and about risk in the decisions taken by managers of big firms and little firms involved in international business. I think risk and uncertainty are fundamental, but we gloss over them because they're very difficult concepts to grapple with.
About the evolution of the field or the culture of IB scholarship, what can you say? What was it like before and what do you see it as?
So I can answer that. I can talk about that from two viewpoints. Some years ago with some colleagues, we actually did a study and published it in a journal called Scientometrics about the evolution of the field. We looked at all the papers published in JIBS up until then, 2007 or thereabouts. So I know a bit about the evolution of the field as recorded in its journal, its premier journal, JIBS. So look, to cut that long story short, I would say IB evolved from a very, very early interest in the nature of the multinational and what it was doing in the world, which was foreign direct investment. Keep in mind, this was just post-World War II. Big firms were becoming prominent. What they were doing overseas was prominent, foreign direct investment. Economists didn't have a lot to say about that. They were still more interested in trade, whereas the IB people theorised that the Buckleys and the Cassons and the Rugmans and the Hennarts and so on. So that was a great foundation for IB, and alongside that was this other interest in the internationalisation process through the Uppsala School, Johansson, Valne and colleagues. So that's been a long-standing interest. And then today we've got new form enterprises. So I feel the field, if you took a very unidirectional viewpoint, could be described as taking a particular interest in how firms respond to changes in the nature and behaviour of markets worldwide. Because firms take the nature and activities going on in markets seriously to the point at which they have to adjust their organisational forms to accommodate those different natures of markets. And that's why we see the global factory today rather than the highly internalised M&E that was post-Second World War. So I suspect that at some stage in the future with digitalisation and so on, we'll see the nature of the international firm evolve even more so. And it will continue to evolve because markets will continue to change and things will happen to change those markets. So yeah, that's basically how I see the field evolving. Markets change, firms adjust to those changes, and therefore a lot of the other things we look at in IB need to be updated and theorised for us to have a better understanding of what's going on in our domain.
Thank you, Peter. About advice and mentoring, who had the most impact on your academic upbringing?
So again, that's interesting. As I said, Professor Lawrence Welch had a lot to do because he wrote his PhD. He taught me as an undergraduate in industrial economics, international economics. He wrote his PhD and published it in the mid-1970s. And I did some work on this in talking about Lawrence's contribution in various forums. And I found it to be the first PhD in the world that had the word internationalization in the title. And he was particularly interested, and he did visit, and he had people from Uppsala visit here in Australia in the early 1970s. So that notion of internationalization was very prominent in his life, and therefore mine, because he used to talk about it. And he was trying to get me to write a PhD earlier than I did, because there was lots of things needed to be done. So he had a great influence. And the other persons who had great influences were my PhD supervisor, Professor Don Lamberton, was actually here at the University of Queensland. He was an information economist, which seems foreign to what we've been talking about, but he was instrumental in getting me through that PhD. And it was that PhD that changed my life from being one in economics to being one in IB, because it had a wider reception in the international business domain than what it did in the economics domain. And the other fellow who had a strong influence was Professor Timo Kavaskull, because he introduced me in the late 1980s to Professor Gary Knight, and invited me to visit he and Gary at Michigan State University in the US, where Gary was writing his PhD. And we met and we had a long talk, and it was a short visit. And I can remember that Gary passed some notes to me under my hotel door early in the morning that I was flying out. And it was a result of our little chat that we wrote our first JIBS paper. And it was about information internalisation rather than markets internalisation. And that got me seriously thinking about publication in JIBS and about thinking about things a little bit differently than what I had previously. So those people were very important to me in the early stages of my career. And I could rattle off lots of names, but those people were instrumental in reorienting me into IB.
Thank you. Peter, about giving advice to young scholars and PhD students, what can you say about things not to do?
Things not to do. Right. One thing that PhD students I would advise not to do would be to get too enthusiastic early in their candidature about collecting data and tinkering with the data analysis. I think that PhD students should spend more time early in their candidature becoming more steeped in the literature, and particularly the literature on theory. I think what we need more in our field and what we need more in our PhD candidates is a stronger commitment to theory. And albeit that's tough to do as a young PhD student, because you can see the clock ticking, and you might feel that you've not got too many footprints on the ground. But I think that investment in understanding theory, becoming cognizant of all the different genre of theory that exist, both in our field and in cognate fields, can be hugely rewarding, rather than too early in the piece tinkering with data.
That's interesting. What is one thing that you would say, I wish I had known that so that it would save so much time, pain and agony, now that I'm looking back?
Well, carrying on from what I did, I wish I had wedded to the theory more so early in my career. Look, I thoroughly enjoy reading theory these days. I would love to be a stronger theorist, but, you do need time. Right at this point in my career, I'm working with a colleague, Catherine Welsh, Lawrence's daughter, and part of that paper, which has not had distribution as yet, is that the view that we could do theory a lot better than we do in IB. And there's a lot more we could be doing with strong old theory by understanding it better than we understand it. And so, yes, I wish I had. I mean, as an economist in the early days, I did wed to theory. In fact, in my PhD, I spent a lot of time in two theories, Williamson's markets and hierarchies paradigm, and also what's called the theory of technological competition. And those two theories formed a substantial part of my PhD. That was necessary because in economics, and Don Lamberton was adamant about this, that it needed to be framed in strong theory. So, yeah, I wish I'd wedded to theory more so early in my career.
Thank you. For the sake of time, what is the question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Oh. Look, I guess given that this is an IB audience, and it's all about us and careers and so on, you could have asked me more about whether I find it a rewarding career and how I find my life in IB fitting in the bigger picture of academe. And I do think about these things because I have spent time in my career, what you might call institution building. I wrote a report here at the University of Queensland back in the late 1990s, early 2000s that led to the formation of our school here called the UQ Business School. So I was instrumental in my previous position at the University of Tasmania in building a school and introducing IB into that school. So I've had to deal with championing IB as a scholarly field in universities, and that's not always been easy because being a derivative field, some people see the internationalization of the functional fields, such as international marketing, international HR, international finance, international accounting, whatever it might be, sufficient training in students to bring an understanding of things international into their lives. I don't accept that because I believe IB to be an integrative field, albeit a derivative field. And as such, we do think about things differently than what, say, international marketers or international HR people might. I think we've got a more expansive view about international things, and I've had to champion that in universities, and I will admit it's been successful. IB is the second most popular major in our programs here in the business school at UQ. We're a large business school. We've got, depending upon how it's measured, 10 to 12,000 students in the business school. About 1 in 5 students at the University of Queensland is a business student. So, and we're a research-intensive science and engineering university. So there's a continual challenge to champion IB as a scholarly field in a science and engineering based university. So that's something that I'm mildly proud of, having been able to do that. But it's something that that I think IB scholars in similar situations around the world are probably grappling with also.
Thank you so much for this interview. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for your time.
Look, thank you. I've enjoyed speaking with you, and I look forward to watching myself. And we're down for posterity now. So, and it's honestly, it's been a great career in IB. It's a great community of scholars, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time. Thank you.
Thanks.